Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for tuning in with us tonight. And if you're visiting, and this is a wonderful place to have visitors, we're so very glad to have you here. Always appreciative of comments in our chat area. It lets us know who's there, and it lets us know what you're thinking. We tend to have some really great comments and questions. We love questions. If you have a question or observation about anything we're talking about tonight. And the subject we're going to be talking about tonight is the subject of the family of Eli. And you can find that in 1 Samuel chapter 2 and 3 and 4, the family of Eli. And the things we want to talk about tonight, when we talk about the family of Eli, is first of all to talk about Eli's home. We're going to be pointing out here in just a few moments that Eli was one of the high priests of God and what it was like to have a home when you were a priest. We're also going to be talking about the sons of Eli. I told you last week this is going to be a sad story. It certainly is when we read about what happened with Eli and his sons, and we're going to be reconnecting and reobserving that tonight. And then we're going to try to make the application that the most important thing we need to learn is that God insists on being put first. And how it is that we prioritize God in our home. There's an important lesson to be learned from Eli in these circumstances. So these are the things that we're going to be talking about here in just a few moments. And I was thinking about this earlier, and it occurred to me that perhaps one of the best things to consider here is the idea that God has demanded from the beginning that he was to be treated as holy. If I were to ask what holiness is, I imagine most of you, in fact, I ask this question every once in a while, and everybody says holy means something that is special, something that is set apart. It has a distinction. It has a characteristic of itself that, sorry about that, that it has a distinction and an importance that causes us to be able to see that it's different. God says, I'm holy, I'm special. And we're supposed to treat God with holiness. This is the idea of reverence, of words like sacrifice, of words that we use many times to describe how it is that we're supposed to consider God. So as we consider these things, let's kind of talk a little bit about Eli and what we see about Eli here and Eli's sons. Now, this is the time, and I'm looking here in 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 12. This is about the time where the Philistines have taken over a good chunk of oppressing Israel and oppressing the 12 tribes. This is before there are any kings, of course. And if you're not too familiar with these accounts, by the way, 1 Samuel is a great book just to read through. It's interesting. It's got some remarkable events in it. It's just one of those books that just keeps you pulled into it. So you wouldn't regret it if you were to sit down and try to read through it if you haven't done it before. But many of us have, and we know that 1 Samuel is the beginning of the story of the kingdom of Israel. Before this, Israel is the 12 tribes that live kind of autonomously, and they're overseen, I'm going to use that word perhaps, by the judges of Israel. In fact, the book of Judges records that time period. It's not easy actually to kind of characterize how much time passes. There's a lot of different debates about how many centuries go from the time that Moses brings the Israelites out of Egypt, and then once they're out of Egypt, they're in the land for the time of the judges until the time of the kings. And the book of 1 Samuel is the beginning of that story, and that story begins with the second to last judge, and his name is Eli. Now, Eli's a very interesting judge. He's kind of got some unusual characteristics about him. He is also a priest. And that's kind of different. In fact, we don't really see any other men that are priests and judges. Now, I want you to know a couple of things about priests. One of the important things is that all the priests had to be descendants of Aaron. You remember Aaron, Moses' brother? We met him back in the book of Exodus. And Eli, I should have looked this up. I think Eli is about 5 generations or so from Aaron. I don't recall. That may not be right. So don't take my word on that. Sometimes I'm just trying to recall and I don't recall now. But Eli is a descendant of Aaron. All the priests had to be. But just maybe an important point to think about for a second. A little later on in Israel's history, in the story of Israel, when the northern half of Israel breaks off from the southern half, they create a priesthood out of commoners, and it's considered an abomination to God. You had to be a descendant of Aaron. And if you couldn't prove you were a descendant of Aaron, you weren't allowed to be a priest. We read about that in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So this is a big deal to be one of Aaron's descendants. Aaron was particularly marked by God as the high priest. He was the person who was supposed to have that particular intercession. I would suggest to you that if you wanted to understand high priests better, one of the places you might go is you might actually go over to the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. In the book of Hebrews, it actually tells us quite a bit about priests. And in fact, one of the questions I'm going to ask you here in just a couple of moments is from the book of Hebrews. And it tells us a lot of the characteristics of the priests. By the way, you might be wondering, does it ever actually use the term high priest to describe Eli? It doesn't. It's more of an assumption that he's the high priest based on almost a necessary inference, since we see his children later, but they actually don't use the term high priest too often in the Old Testament. And I've always kind of found that interesting too, that term is, while it's used, it's not used too often. Well, as I said, we know that there in the city of Shiloh is where the tabernacle is located, not the temple yet. That's not going to be built for another 100 years or so. But the tabernacle is there, and that's the place where Israel was supposed to come worship God. And Eli is both the judge of Israel and he's the priest. Let's just say he's the high priest of Israel. And so he has particular duties. And one of his sons is supposed to replace him. We met his sons in chapter 1 and verse 3 very briefly last week when we were reading about Elkanah, who came to serve. And his sons' names are Hophni, and sometimes we pronounce this name Phinehas. It's kind of an interesting name. Pinchas is the Hebrew word there, and Pinchas means the head of a serpent. I just always found that kind of interesting. And Hophni means a brawler or a fighter. So that's kind of interesting names that they had. But there was a very famous Phinehas or Pinchas back in the Old Testament before him. He was the grandson of Aaron, and he saved Israel by destroying works of idolatry, by killing two people who were committing a sexual idolatry before all Israel. And God said, because what you did saved Israel, I'm going to make a special covenant with you and your descendants. And Eli is, and some infer the idea that Eli is this descendant. God's going to reference this covenant here in just a couple of moments. So here's Eli. Here are his two sons. And when we read about him here, we read about this in verse 12. The sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Lord. You know, it's kind of neat. If you have a different translation, there's lots of different words that are used there. This is the New King James. I think the King James is my favorite. The King James is the only one that's literal to the Hebrew when it says they were sons of Belial. Now, Belial was one of the names of Satan. So when it's describing somebody who's really evil in the Old Testament, the expression, the sons of the devil, is a common term. You might think about that Jesus used that term to describe the priests in his time in John chapter 8, when he says, you do the deeds of your father, Satan. That's just kind of a neat little thing to think about here. And I want you to be thinking about parallels to other priests that were wicked men, because that's an important point. In fact, if we think about this, a few centuries before, there were two priests, Nadab and Abihu. They're relatives, right? Because they're all descended from Aaron. And these two priests went before God in the tabernacle, and they did so carelessly and with a foreign fire, not the fire God had prescribed. And they were incinerated. They were burned up by God. So that's something certainly to keep in our mind, that Aaron had these two sons that did something wicked, and now here is Eli with these two sons. And as we talk about these sons and the things they did, before we get into their sins, let's ask ourselves some questions tonight. I need you to kind of talk to me a little bit about the characteristics of priests. The first question I want you to consider here: why do we need to understand Old Testament priests? That's the first question I want you to think about tonight. Why is it that we need to have an understanding of Old Testament priests? Going to have a couple other questions, and I'm going to have you go over to Hebrews 5:1 to answer question number 2. Hopefully you might have even done it ahead of time. That'd be great. That work, by the way, let me just make a shameless plug here. Our website has this class material, and that's www.sunsetchurchofchrist.net. And anytime you want, you can take a look at that material there. www.sunsetchurchofchrist.net is where we keep our material under our resources page. And it has a handout for this class, and these questions are put there already. The question is, why do we need to understand Old Testament priests? I got some answers already, so I want to grab these. Here's an interesting point that Stephen brings out. He says the first priest mentioned in the Bible occurs in Genesis 14 and verse 18. Now, Stephen, you didn't mention the name, but we know who you're talking about here. You're talking about a priest named Melchizedek, a man of immeasurable importance for us to know about. So that's an important point. Stephen goes on to say that there appear to be 10 mentions of this high priest, that's Melchizedek, throughout the Bible, a foreshadowing of our high priest, Christ. Stephen, what's really neat about what you said there is that one of the things we need to know about priests is we were supposed to understand from the Old Testament how the work of high priests was a foreshadow to the work that Jesus does for us. And so it's important we know something about Old Testament priests and how they worked and what they did. And Stephen bringing us to Melchizedek is an important point for us to consider. I do appreciate that. I also see here that Teresa's got a comment, and Teresa says, because we are priests in the kingdom of God today. And Gregor says much the same thing when he says, we are the priests under the new covenant. That's an answer I was looking for too. We want to look to Christ as our high priest, but we are the priests today. So in other words, there was a system created in the Old Testament where you had the high priest, and beneath him you had the various priests, and some would be the high priest's sons, as we see here, but then they would be just kinsmen, various descendants of Aaron, like Elkanah must have been. And one of the things we want to understand is that the high priest was the one who did the most important works of atonement before God, and he was the one that cleansed the priests and the tabernacle, and then the priests were the ones that then offered the sacrifices and the worship to God. So if we understand that idea, we're grabbing a really important thing about our relationship with God today. Christ our high priest, we who are in Christ serve as the priests of God, able to do special and important things. Grant goes on to say this: the duties of Old Testament priests are a reflection of the worship that we have today. Grant, you're exactly right. In fact, Grant, I kind of want to hold that thought for a second and bring it back in our question, because that's a great point for the next two questions. We're talking about the work of high priests and the things that they're doing there. But I'll come back to that here in just a second. I've also got a comment here from Lamar. Lamar says, understanding Old Testament priests helps us better understand Jesus as our high priest. Holy, Lamar, I think you're saying a holy teacher and sacrifice. Not sure if teacher was the word you wanted there, but from the context, but it does fit that Jesus is a great teacher for us. The priests were meant to teach the people, by the way. That is a point that we were told throughout the scriptures, that the priests were supposed to instruct the Israelites on how they were to behave. So you guys have it right. These are exactly the things we're looking to understand. You know why we should study Old Testament priests, because that's actually our study of Christ and our relationship with Christ. And the question I asked you a second ago was, according to Hebrews 5:1, what is the work of a priest? And I want you, looking at that second question there, let me just help you out for a second, and I'll bring up Hebrews 5:1 for just a moment. Here is the statement, and it's talking in particular about the high priest, but this is true of priests. It says, for every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men and things pertaining to God. And now he's going to give us some things here, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sin. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also subject to weakness. Because of this, he's required, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer sacrifices for sins. No man may take this honor on himself, but he was called God, just as Abraham was. So that's an important point for us to consider. And the question there, what is it that they do? I don't know if you see two things in what we read or three things, and how would you summarize those things as the works of the priests? And this is important to understand, because some ways what we want to consider is that if these are the works of the priests, people who weren't priests weren't supposed to be doing that. Now, they did sometimes. I'm going to be careful to say that these are things that God may have winked at, that sometimes men offered sacrifices when it was supposed to be the priests. But the important point, and Grant says it here, is that the work of the priest was to offer sacrifices, but not just any kinds of sacrifices. First of all, he was to offer sacrifices for sin. To take away sin, a priest could offer a sacrifice. Secondly, though, he's also to offer gifts to God. In other words, things that are pleasing to God, he is the one who's authorized to offer those things. If you wanted to be more specific, you could talk about the kinds of sacrifices. They had to be certain kinds of animals. They had to be offered in certain ways. That's about to get real important when we come to our second point tonight about the sons of Eli. The sacrifices had to be handled in a very specific way. God said, that's part of treating me holy, is that you do the things that I've given you to do in the way that I've given you to do it. So this is an important point. So two things I see there: sacrifices and gifts to God, or sacrifices for sin and gifts to God. And the gifts of God can be themselves sacrifices. Oftentimes the term sacrifice is used. I see here, Lamar has it too. Priests gave gifts and sacrifices for sin. Various offerings required by the Old Testament law and blood offering. And Lamar, that's real important, what you said there about the blood offering, because a lot of the language, especially in the book of Hebrews, makes us understand that blood was always required for a sacrifice for sin. Again, this is all about Jesus, that we're learning about Jesus and about our work as priests. So I hope you get a sense from looking at these different things of what we're doing today. Because today, I asked the third question, how are we still offering these things? And Teresa grabs it right away. She says, we'll go over to Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. She says, today we are offering spiritual sacrifices. 1 Peter 2 and verse 5, our bodies are living sacrifices, Romans 12:1. Grant picked that up too. Grant, I missed you there a second. Sorry. Today we offer the sacrifices of the New Testament, such as our bodies. And Grant goes to the same verse, Romans 12:1. I'm really proud of you guys. That's exactly a great verse to consider, Romans 12:1. You are living sacrifices. And we offer praise. Grant points to Hebrews 13:15, the sacrifice of the fruit of our lips. When we sing songs, we talked about that Sunday just recently, about how praising in song is part of the sacrificial system of the New Testament. That's important. And maybe you're getting this really important idea that what God says is you need to treat this work as something holy, something really important. Grant also goes on to say, and Grant, I didn't finish the passage. He says also doing good and sharing. He says that's a pleasing sacrifice to God too. Fantastic. I'm glad you grabbed that. Debbie says we offer our life to God as a sacrifice. Now again, everybody has pointed to Romans 12:1 and 2 about living sacrifices. And if you're not familiar with that term, it doesn't mean the idea that I take my life. It's the idea that I live my life for Christ. I am alive as a living sacrifice for God. Everything that I am is given to Him. Cindy Wade's got it. She points out, today we live as Christians, we're sacrificing our whole life to Christ. She grabs that term fruit of our lips too. Thanks, Cindy. Right on. That's exactly right. That Hebrews 13 talks about the sacrifice that's the fruit of our lips. So we're offering sacrifices to God. Interestingly enough, we're not really offering a sacrifice for sin, because Christ was the once and for all sacrifice for sin. So that's important. I'm really pleased that there were a lot of great comments that really helped us to flush out the idea of the Old Testament priesthood well. And I really feel like we've got a good grasp of why this is important, that we see these things and what we're supposed to be doing here. Good comments that allow us to go to step number 2. All of you, if you're in Christ, you're a priest. And so you might think of yourself like the sons of Eli, people who are called to be priests of God. But these two men, as we just read a second ago, and let's go back to this passage. Let's look at this again. These two men, I've got to go back. We're still in Hebrews here. These two men weren't doing what's right. Let's read about that. Verse 13, the priest's custom with the people was that when any man offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged flesh hook in his hand while the meat was boiling. He'd thrust it in the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and the priest would take for himself all that the flesh hood brought up. So they did in Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Also, before they burned the fat, the priest's servant would come and say to the man who sacrificed, "Give meat for roasting for the priest, for he will not take boiled meat from you, but raw." If the man said to him, "They really should burn the fat first, then you may take as much as your heart desires." Let me move up for a second. He would then answer him, "No, but you must give it to now, and if not, I will take it by force." Therefore, the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for the men abhorred the offering of God. That's a powerful statement there. Abhorred the offering of God because of what they're doing. In our handout, I kind of made a point to you that hopefully you are aware of, that in Leviticus, it describes for us the work of the priests. And one of the things that came was that the priests were allowed to take from the leftovers of the sacrifices after the fat had been burned, after the meat had been cooked and some of it had been offered to God. They were allowed to take a portion afterwards for themselves. So you grab what's going on here if you understand that what these men are doing is they're going in beforehand, before the sacrifice is made, before the meat is cooked, and they're taking probably what's assumed to be the best cuts of meat for themselves. And this was not what the law allowed. And a lot of the Israelites seemed to know that. And they said, "Why don't you let us, cook it, sacrifice it first?" But they're not allowing that to happen. They're taking these things and just satisfying themselves. And the terminology here is they're abhorring the sacrifice of God. Go on a little further here. And what we also read then in verse... Here in verse 22, it tells us, it goes on to say, Eli was very old and he heard everything his sons did to Israel. Here's another sin they did, though, and how they lay with the women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. So these men are committing fornication as well with the people of Israel. Hophni and Phinehas, or Pinchas, as we might say. Here are two men that are supposed to be serving God. They're supposed to be glorifying God. And instead, they are abhorring the sacrifice of God. They're insulting God. They're bringing about a disgust by God for the things that God has told them to honor. I got a comment here from Lamar. Deuteronomy 18:13 declares that what the priests were to receive and Eli's sons were taking whatever they wanted. And here Lamar is about to sum up the real issue. Eli, I appreciate this, Lamar, and this is Lamar's statement in our chat. Lamar says, Eli failed in not correcting his sons. This is an important point for us to understand, especially since we do see a type of rebuke here in verse 23 and 24. As Eli hears about this, he said to them, "Why do you do such things? I hear of your evil dealings from all the people." He says, "No, my sons, it's not a good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people transgress." And he goes on to say, if a man sins against the Lord, who's going to intercede? But they didn't heed the voice of their father. Now, as we press on here, what you see in verse 27 then is that God goes on through a prophet of God in verse 27 to bring about a curse on the house of Eli. He makes a point to talk about how it is that he has brought them out of Egypt, how it was that he made this important priesthood and the concept of the priesthood. In verse 28, he talks about that. And then he says, here you are insulting me. And I want you to look at verse 29. And honor your sons more than me. You honor your sons more than me. Now you might wonder, why is it that Eli is getting the blame for this? And I've wondered about this next verse. To make yourself fat with the best of all the offerings. You may know this, but one of the characteristics that's used to describe Eli in 1 Samuel chapter 4 was that he was a very fat man. It's not impossible that what God is saying here is that Eli himself was partaking of the things that his sons were stealing. When God says to Eli, you've made yourself fat with the best of all the offerings, while they could just be talking about his sons, verse 30, he goes on to bring it to Eli too. So while Eli wasn't the one reaching in and taking these things out, and Eli might not be totally aware of how this is happening, Eli's the one benefiting from it. Teresa asks a great question. Teresa says this in the chat. Teresa says, I have to wonder why he did not know before he heard from the people. And Teresa, the scriptures don't really tell us, but I have a thought. And my thought goes back to verse 29 here. That maybe Eli doesn't want to know because he is benefiting from what they're doing. In other words, maybe Eli is, he's thinking that, I just don't want to know. Now, Teresa goes on to say, maybe he's just thinking as long as nobody complained, it's not worth bringing up. And a lot of times that's the case too. If nobody's upset by this, and it seems like some people were upset, but maybe until it gets to his ear, it doesn't seem that way. It might be the case too. We just don't know. But whatever it is, God is going to make it clear. He says, I made a covenant, verse 30, and this is probably talking about the covenant with Phinehas, by the way, his ancestor, not his son, the ancestor, the grandson of Aaron, about how this would go. And in verse 31, he says, behold, the days are coming. I'll cut off your arm and the arm of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house. You'll see an enemy dwelling in my place, despite all the good which God does for Israel, and there shall not be an old man in your house forever. That's a pretty profound curse that's brought by God for these things. I got a comment here I want to bring up. Lamar says, Eli seemed to be focused on his priestly duties for the peoples and failed to lead his family in the process. Now then Lamar brings up something I think is very interesting. He says he did well with Samuel. That's a great comment, because the Word of God tells us that effectively Eli raised Samuel, and he did that well. So that's very interesting. And Lamar, I kind of would love to explore this comment a little more, because I think it's really interesting that sometimes people who are focused on righteous things and important things tend to neglect other things. In this case, we're talking about family. Whatever it is, let's go ahead and go to our questions here in just a second that we have pulled up. I got a couple of questions for you to think about. Here's just a real kind of off-the-wall thought question for you. The first thought question, what are some other sins that came because people wanted to eat something? You can probably think of a couple of those. And how might that relate to the temptation of Jesus? I know these are kind of off the wall, but I'll kind of step back for a second, though, going back to what Lamar said a moment ago. It really is interesting that sometimes people tend to over-focus on one thing and not focus enough on the other. And we're about to get into a slew of people who may have done just that, Lamar. As we move forward, we're going to be talking next week about David and his family. We're going to talk about some of the other kings of Israel. And these are men that are called righteous before God, and yet they were, can I say it, not effective fathers, not good fathers in the things that they did. In fact, what I think is interesting, we skipped over Samuel and his sons next week, in part because the story of Samuel and his sons that's found later in the book of 1 Samuel is almost identical to Eli, in the sense that his sons are also called worthless men, that is to say Samuel. What I think is fascinating is that here we have the high priest, next we have the prophet, and then we have the king of Israel. Three very important men who were doing the work of God, and all three failed when it came to raising up righteous sons. I find that very interesting. And as I said, we're not going to be talking about Samuel and his family. There's actually not much said about them other than they were wicked. But we will talk quite a bit about David next week and his family. And I think that's really a good point and worth considering here. What are some times where people sinned with food? One of the ones I was thinking of, Debbie grabbed, Esau. Esau despised, and I was going to say ate something, but then I thought, well, it was because he wanted something to eat. Esau despised his birthright, the Bible says, all for a bowl of stew. And we're reminded of that in Hebrews chapter 12, the warning there. Here's another one. Monique's, Teresa grabbed Esau too when he sold his birthright. Now, Teresa and Monique both go back to Israel and manna. And Monique just says, we want meat. We're tired of manna. And God was so angry with them for this complaining that when they begged for meat and they were given manna, God was so upset because of this complaining. Grant has David. David sinned by taking the holy bread when his men were hungry, which led to the death of the priests. Grant, I don't know what to think of that one, actually. Jesus uses that later as an example of sometimes you may have to break the rules. And I'm not sure entirely that the sin was that or lying to those priests, but the priest certainly died for what he did. And so that's a really good one that's a really complicated one to me. But we'll put it on the list for sure. Here's another one. Stephen has Numbers 11, verses 31 through 35, relates to the miracle of the quail. And they were greedy and they were unthankful. So God brought a severe plague upon them. I got another one, Lindsay. Saul's army eating raw flesh and blood after the order to fast. That's a fantastic statement. And then finally, the one that I thought everybody would grab first, the common ancestor all of us have, Eve in the garden. Eve wanted something to eat, and she saw it looked good to eat. It was pleasing to the eye, and the desire to be made wise, and we know how that piece of fruit turned out too. I find it very interesting to consider all the different times men were led to sin by food. I find it a little bit problematic for Brian because Brian really likes food. And the point is that all through the scriptures, we see food was something that caused a lot of people to stumble and to like Esau, to lose great things about this. So these are fantastic ones. There was a couple of them you guys brought in. I had forgot about. I didn't think about Saul. I forgot about that. And when you guys brought up the children of Israel, I wasn't even thinking of that. I was thinking of Esau, and I was thinking of I was thinking of Jonathan breaking the order of his father. But I think all of these are just fantastic points that we want to consider. Might just kind of throw this. I'll tell you what, for the sake of time, I'll answer this next one. When I said, how does this relate to the temptation of Jesus? Well, remember in Matthew chapter 4, Jesus was tempted to turn stones to bread. And I've always kind of felt that what we're seeing here is Jesus being tempted in one of the most base and common temptations known to man, the desire to eat and to satisfy an appetite. And of course, that can mean so many different things, but you might get a sense of why sometimes eating the wrong thing can have such detrimental spiritual consequences. And that's certainly something for us to think about as we consider this. I want you to kind of, another question though, if you would think about this. This is the question that maybe pertains more to what we're looking at here. How would you summarize the sins of Eli's sons? How would you kind of bring this up and try to characterize this, and maybe even say, let me give you a couple of ways you could answer this. Summarize those sins or characterize the root of those sins. If you just had to give a one-sentence answer about the sins and you didn't want to describe what they were, but you wanted to describe why they were, what would you say about the sins of Eli's sons? What do you think about that? And I'm looking for a couple of answers. Teresa, right off the top, she's got some good points. She says fleshly, carnal, demonic, ungodly, greedy, selfish. I love it. I love it. Because I was thinking of James 3 when you said that, and the wisdom from the earth, which is fleshly and carnal, demonic. Fantastic. They're really utterly men of the flesh, and that pertains to the appetite of their stomach, and it pertains to their sexual appetite too. So both of those things fit that nicely. Grant says Eli's sons were greedy and covetous and had no love for God. Great point, Grant. I'm going to come back to this here in a second because I think you're kind of also giving us a summary of what the root of this problem was. Stephen says gluttony, fornication, desecration. Important word, Stephen. I'm glad you used it. Because fundamentally, God says they're abhorring the sacrifice of God. Desecration. God says, I'm holy. Eli's sons are not doing this. And that goes straight to what Rob says here. Rob says they disrespected the Old Testament law. That's right. They didn't treat holy something that was holy as being in a position of someone who was to be an example of it. So not only are they not being holy, but because they were held to a stronger standard of priests of God, that made it that much worse. I'll tell you what, I'm going to say something that we need to think about that in pertaining to us, but I'll tell you what, let's go back to our questions. I got a couple more comments to grab here. Lamar says Eli's sons were arrogant and prideful and did not have the discipline needed at home to correct them. Again, Lamar, you're grabbing on to the main point of application of where we're going with this. The problem is Eli is not rebuking his sons. He is not disciplining his sons. Now, I want to say that perhaps we're given a big point here back at verse 12 about Eli's failure, about their problem. In verse 12, it told us the sons of Eli were corrupt. Look at this. They did not know the Lord. You know, it's interesting to me that all through Israel's history, they struggled with bad priests. And there were a lot of priests that just didn't seem to know much about God. I always use the example of Hilkiah in the time of Josiah, who's, he's not called an evil man, and yet it's clear he didn't know much about being a priest. And I would have you get a sense of how abhorrent it is that a person who serves with the holy things of God, not knowing what's holy and what's not able to discern between what is holy and what is not holy, is an abomination. It is a terrible thing. And that's kind of moving us up to this last question that I want you to consider for just a second. The last question is, why is it such a terrible sin? Anthony has the point. He says, Anthony says, Eli should have removed his sons from serving and I believe you're saying brought an end to these events. Anthony, can I ask you to clarify for a second? Specifically, what was it he was supposed to have done with his sons? And this is a hard Old Testament point, but Anthony, can you tell us what was supposed to have happened with his sons for their behavior and for what they were doing? So if you can fill that back in, Anthony, we'd appreciate that. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but you brought a really good point, and I want to take it just a step further. But the point is, why is this such a terrible sin? Why is desecration so awful? Teresa says this: it disregards God, what God has set apart for his purposes. And Teresa, I think maybe this next part is the clincher, and selfishly puts you ahead of God. So these sons are doing something that I think at first, if you were watching it happen, you might not think it's the worst thing. These guys bring a sacrifice in, they set it down. The priest says, no, let me cut my part off first. He's going to get it later. You think, well, he's going to get it later. That's okay. Go ahead and take it now. But it was desecration. And I would suggest to you that maybe one of the keys to think about here is it was desecration because it put them before God. Now that leads us to the second question in a lot of ways too. Leads us to the second question because we can still do this. We are the priests of God today. We can still desecrate the things of God. Remember our sacrifices, our living sacrifice, or remember the sacrifice of the fruit of our lips? We can still desecrate those sacrifices and end up bringing an abomination before God if we don't treat these things as holy. You might think for a second, what are some ways you desecrate the sacrifice of the fruit of your lips? Singing. What are some ways you desecrate the sacrifice, the living sacrifice that we make for ourselves? Stephen James has got a comment. He says, maybe cases where we receive communion unworthily. Great, Stephen, because what does 1 Corinthians say? But we bring judgment upon ourselves in chapter 11 if we take it in a manner that doesn't discern. Now, Stephen, what else is there to discern but what is holy and what is common? And the Corinthians were taking communion as though it was a common meal and it was abominable. Great comment, Stephen, because you say also we should be mindful of grieving the Holy Spirit or blasphemy against him as well. And Stephen, I think that those might be nice descriptions of what it is to desecrate something that's holy. Grant says, it utterly throw aside all the good things God has done for us in favor of our own selfishness. We can do it today in the same way Eli's sons did, acting for our own desires against God's commandments. Right on, Grant. That's exactly right. The idea of doing what I want to do before doing what God has said want to do when I'm a priest of God. Here's Teresa. By putting other things or people above what should be our number one priority to love God, obey his commandments, and serve him. And Rob answered the question here I threw out there. Anthony didn't get a chance to get back yet. And Rob points to stoning. What I wanted to say was this. Rob, you're right in the idea that you were supposed to put to death. I don't think it was the idea that Eli's sons merely needed to be removed. They actually needed to be put to death for what they had done. In Numbers chapter 11, God put Aaron's sons to death for not taking things holy. And so we would understand, and we might understand from other commandments too, specifically something we're going to look at here in just a moment in the book of Hebrews, that what we're supposed to do is understand that these things, they were to be put to death. George has got another example. Couples living together without marriage. Great point, George. God gave us marriage. Men say, no, I'd rather do this. Religious people changing the worship to please themselves. Yeah, that's kind of where I was thinking too. People bring in the piano and they say, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is you're bringing the piano or the guitar or whatever, the band, in the worship that God has dictated. And what you're really doing is putting your desire above God. You're becoming Hophni and Phinehas when you bring a piano into the worship of God. When you bring in the things that just make worship more fun, when you change the things just to make yourself more satisfied, you change the way that services are held or when they're held in order to satisfy your desires, what you have done is you've committed the sins of Hophni and Phinehas. You have abhorred the sacrifices of God. Paul would warn that some people would try to come up with different rules about how to serve in the flesh and things that you can do. They'd say you couldn't be married or you couldn't eat certain things, and he said all those things were wrong, the creations of men. I've got a couple more comments here, or I got one more comment. Teresa says willfully sinning, like neglecting to assemble. Teresa, let's come back to that here in a second. That's a good one. And I want to use it here as an example for something we're coming back to. But I want to go on and finish up with our application point. And let me grab that for just a point. Our application point is this. Priests of God, whether then or now, had an obligation before God. And that obligation was that God was to come first. That God was to come before all things. And that included, in Eli's case, his sons. And let's look at it like this. The different things you might think about. God is supposed to be more important to us than our family. I might suggest to you that's not always true of people. Some people prize their family more than God. And a great example of that is just like what would happen with Eli, that they refused to discipline their children. Lamar's made a great comment, a great observation about how important it is that we bring discipline in the home. Eli's lesson is all about the absence of discipline, and the result of which is that people do not know God if they do not know discipline. Did you catch that? I'll tell you what, I'll give the credit to Lamar because he's really hammered this well. If you don't discipline in the home, you can't know God. Because God is a God of discipline, of the expectation of consequences. And if you don't discipline in the home, you cannot know God. Lots of people, though, they put their family before God. People put work before God. They make work the priority of their life and the defining characteristic. And, they pursue education for that ends, and they neglect the things of God. We talk to our young people all the time, and we tell them, hey, when you're picking a college, make sure you're not putting that in front of God in your service to God. That's important to all of you to think about. Your pleasure, your recreation, we play sports, we play games, we take fun trips. None of those things should come before God. Even our country. Our country's important, but it's not more important than God. A lot of things we could say about this, but I know we're coming up on our time and we really need to hammer down these last couple of points as we consider these things. A priest's obligation before God was to put God first. God warned Eli several times. You read about that, hopefully, in chapter 3 and chapter 4. First through the man of God, and then subsequently through Samuel himself. Now, I would suggest to you that part of the reason that God gave him multiple warnings, even though it even says early on God intended to destroy, to kill, and to wipe out this family line over this, that the big idea here was that God wanted it to be understood that whenever the ark was taken, it wasn't because God was weak. Okay, this is an important point in the story. Maybe let me just point this out. In a couple of chapters, the Philistines are going to attack Shiloh. They're going to apparently destroy the tabernacle. I'm sorry. That's not till later. I'm sorry. That the Israelites take the Ark of the Covenant out. I'm getting my accounts in the Bible a little off. The Israelites take the Ark into battle against the Philistines, and the Philistines will take the Ark and take it away. And perhaps one of the things we need to understand is that God doesn't want Israel to think, well, it just happened because God is weak. God specifically said it happened. The glory was taken away, and that's what he predicts. My glory is going to be taken away because you didn't glorify me. And that's on Eli and his house. So God will say it twice to them that they're going to be destroyed. Now, I would suggest to you that perhaps the greater reason that they were destroyed was for us, the true priests of God. Now, all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the end of the ages have come. This is important. The thing we want to consider here for a second is to understand the idea that the destruction of the house of Eli, a priest of God, his sons priests of God, that happened so that we can say, God is serious about being holy. In fact, we go on, and this is the passage that Teresa was kind of alluding to before with forsaking the assembly, because in Hebrews 10, verse 26 and 27, it talks about forsaking the assembly and the willful sin that's found in that. And the Hebrew writer reminds us that anyone who had rejected Moses' law dies. That's what happened to Hophni and Phinehas. They died without mercy of the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Of how much worse punishment. Now, here's the main point the Hebrew writer wants you to think about. How much worse punishment do you suppose will he be thought worthy who has trampled the Son of God underfoot, counted the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified a common thing, and insulted the Spirit of grace? Now, in a fashion, under the old law, that's exactly what these men did. But here the New Testament is saying that those of us who are priests of God today, that we risk making a far more deadly point today. I know we're at our time, so I'm not going to get your answers here on these questions, but I want to make a couple of points. And actually, Monique makes one of them for me when she says, notice our obligation as parents does not end when the kids leave home. We have an obligation to rebuke when our adult children are in sin. Monique, what's neat about what you're saying in that statement is that we might consider for a moment that Eli really had a responsibility to rebuke any of the priests that were in sin. We're told today that if we see our brother sin, we're to go to them and we're to confront them in that sin. Matthew chapter 18 talks about that. And it's important that we understand we're not supposed to allow sin to sit. Maybe it's like Eli and maybe we let sin sit because, we just hope nobody notices it. That was something Teresa said I liked. Maybe it's like, maybe we're benefiting from the fact that people are sinning and we just don't want to bring it to a stop. It's their sin, it's not mine. But there's something really important for us to consider about sin. Eli didn't hold back on his sons. And in doing so, he put his children before God. This is important. If you put your children before God, you're not doing them any favors. They're going to be destroyed because they're not going to know God. And then God's going to destroy you. This is a big thing. Lots of people put their children before God unknowingly, unwittingly, unintentionally. They see to their children's desires and pleasures before they see to the things that are owed to God, or they refuse to bring about the discipline that God insists that they bring upon their children. They don't do what they need to do because it's not pleasant, it's not fun, or it's just whatever reason it might be. and they're lost. They're destroyed. And Eli's lesson is that we could be destroyed for that too. What if Eli had, the first time his sons cut that sacrifice off, stopped him? The first time he heard about them with the women at the tent, put an end to it right there on the spot. He could have done that. What if that had happened? What kind of story would this be? I would guess we'd probably never hear about it. But he didn't. Let's wrap up with a couple of your comments here. Anthony says, God provides ample opportunity for us to repent. That's a great thing. You know, Anthony, you think about that for a second. We can be the vilest of sinners. We can be the Phineas and Hophni, and yet we can still appeal to our high priest, and we can be cleansed of any sin. God went to Eli twice, and Eli, I would feel, that could have done something about this in those times, but it seems pretty clear he didn't do much of anything. He didn't break down and repent in sackcloth and ashes as sometimes people would do. As we'll see next week, talking a little bit about David and the things that David did. Teresa says, children are taught by example or neglect, good or bad. You're right. And again, it brings you back to wonder about Eli and why it was that a man like that, who you might say was a good man in many ways, a faithful judge of Israel, and yet was a terrible father. And because he was a terrible father, in a priestly family, brought destruction to the entire nation. You know, we might consider today that we are the priests of God. And if we don't do what's right in our family, our families can bring destruction to the church, to the local church. I've seen just that. You probably have too. Eli is an important lesson to think about. We got a lot of things to think about. And as I said, not a happy story, but an important one for us to consider. I had some great comments tonight. I wish we could have spent more time. I know I'm past our time right now, and I appreciate you guys are always really good to hang around for a few moments after our 45 minutes is up. But we'll pick up next week. We're going to talk about David and his sons. Again, not a happy story, I'm sorry to say. David's going to be an important lesson too. It's going to sound a lot like this one, but we're going to bring in some other measures about why David's failures predicated on other things that we need to consider, such as how sexual immorality does damage to a family, to a home. But these are all important things. Thanks again. Some great comments, great thoughts tonight. And all of you, may God bless you in this week.